Hi, this is Mark Hamill, a graduate student of philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. This brief multimedia presentation is a semester project, the subject of which is a brief exploration of the eternal fate of virtuous pagans, as treated in Dante's Divine Comedy. The primary sources for the presentation are all three of Dante's canticas, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. So what is the Dantean assigned eternal condition for the virtuous pagan? In the Inferno's fourth canto, we see that Dante locates such souls, along with the unbaptized children, in the first circle of hell, limbo. Ostensibly, this is consistent with Catholic teaching, but there is the sobering reality that their judgment seems, in many ways, unjust, especially for those who have truly lived a life of virtue, but because of no fault of their own, lived prior to the public revelation and sacramental baptism, or lived after, but did not have the opportunity to be evangelized as such. So is Dante's theology right? In other words, how does it square with the Church's teaching on the matter of the virtuous pagan's salvation? And in this presentation, we're going to review a handful of things. As introduced here, the Dantean predicament of virtuous pagans, the four last things, the necessity of baptism itself, the contrapasso of the unbaptized. We'll talk about some Dantean inconsistencies, or rather, perhaps, some missed opportunities to grant these virtuous pagans salvation. And with that, a reasonable hope for salvation. What are those? And ultimately, we'll wrap things up. So where do we start? We start, actually, in the first circle of hell, which is where limbo is, the unbaptized children and the virtuous pagans. And I read you an excerpt from Canto 4, and this is Dante in the beginning, and then it transitions to Virgil. No tortured wailing rose to greet us here, but sounds of sighing rose from every side, sending a tremor through the timeless air. A grief breathed out of untormented sadness, the passive state of those who dwelled apart, men, women, children, a dim and endless congress. And the master, meaning Virgil, said to me, "You do not question what souls these are that suffer here before you? I wish you to know before you travel on that these were sinless, and still their merits fail, for they lacked baptism's grace, which is the door of the true faith you were born to. Their birth fell before the age of the Christian mysteries, and so they did not fully worship God's Trinity in fullest duty. I am one of these. For such defects are we lost, though spared the fire and suffering hell in one affliction only, that without hope we live on in desire." Dante and Virgil meet the great poets, Homer, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan, and later enter into the citadel of human reason, wherein reside the great pagan thinkers, the master souls of antiquity, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Democritus, Diogenes, Thales, Averroes, and so many. These represent those who have achieved great things, aided only by the human light of natural reason, without the benefit of divine revelation, nor the salvific or redemptive effects of Jesus Christ. These are the folks, the souls, who are left after the harrowing of hell. We know that in 1 Peter chapter 3, he references what is known as the limbo of the fathers. Put to death in the flesh, he, meaning Christ, was brought to life in the Spirit. In it he also went to preach to the spirits in prison who had once been disobedient. In Canto 4, Virgil shared his own witness of the event. I was still new to this estate of tears when a mighty one descended here among us, crowned with the sign of his victorious years. He took from us the shade of our first parent, of Abel, his pure son. And he continues on. And before these, you must know, no human soul had ever won salvation. As we think about this, it would not be unreasonable to believe that before the harrowing, the virtuous pagans were living in blissful ignorance. So it is edifying to quickly review the four last things. How do souls get appointed or assigned? And in Hebrews chapter 9, and I quote, "It is appointed to man to die once, and after this the judgment," meaning the particular judgment. So we know, step one, obviously we die. Number two, we get judged. And number three, we go to either heaven, or actually we may go to number four, which is hell. It's an either or. And of course, there's a potential layover on the way to heaven. The four last things are necessarily definitive, yet we know, as stated in Revelation chapter 21, verse 27, nothing unclean will enter heaven. And according to Matthew 5:26, once one is judged and thrown into prison, you will not be released until you have paid the last penny. So as we consider that, what is the criteria for judgment? That second step. We know that those who die in God's grace and friendship are perfectly purified, live forever with Christ. That's obviously the condition or the criteria to get to heaven. Those who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation, but after death they undergo purification. So that means they go to purgatory and then go to heaven. And then we have the last, those who die in a state of mortal sin descend into hell. The fourth option. But it seems that the virtuous pagans are free of mortal sin. And they may or may not be perfectly purified, but recall that Virgil indicated that they were sinless. And as we reflect on the seven deadly sins and the corresponding prominent roles in the architecture and punishment within hell, or the purgation and purgatory, we can understand how a virtuous pagan, based solely on the criteria of virtue, would be no candidate for hell, and if so, placed would skate through each of the seven cornices within Mount Purgatory. Indeed, it is not a few times that the whips within the cornices reflected virtuous pagans. Certainly, we must note that the virtuous pagans possess the four cardinal virtues, but do not possess, understandably, the three theological virtues. But what about God's grace and friendship, which we know cannot be earned? We know that sanctifying grace makes the soul pleasing to God. But we also know, through baptism, that's how we get that sanctifying grace, at least initially. We know that whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. What about baptism? Gregory the theologian, also known as Gregory of Nazianzus, reasoned the following three classes of unbaptized. We have number one, those who refuse baptism, and they will be punished for all of their sins, including their contempt for that sacrament. There's number two, those who delayed baptism until just prior to death, but waited a bit too long. In other words, they died before they were baptized. And they will be punished for their sins, including their neglect. However, their punishment will be less severe than that assigned to the first class, those who had contempt for that actual sacrament. And then we get to category 3, which is really pertains to our virtuous pagans, those who through no fault of their own were never baptized. And what will their punishment be? Well, they will have no punishment as such, in that they are without wickedness or malice and have suffered rather than caused their loss of baptism. While they escape infernal punishment, they receive no heavenly reward. St. Gregory came to that in such a way, and this was actually quoted by St. Thomas. They do not reach the glory of heaven. They do not therefore suffer the eternal punishment suffered by the damned. Because, and actually this is where the quote starts, because there's a mean between the two, since he who deserves not honor and glory is not for that reason worthy of punishment. And on the other hand, he who is not deserving of punishment is not for that reason worthy of glory and honor. End quote. So where are we? In Canto 4, Virgil, in explaining the predicament of the virtuous pagans, basically said this: the signature of honor they left on earth is recognized in heaven and wins them ease in hell out of God's favor. Most would never associate the words ease and hell together, other than perhaps the sinner can seemingly ease himself into hell. So let's dig into that quote. It is as if it's a contrapasso of ease in hell. And this is from the Summa Theologica, the supplement, Appendix 1. And I'll read each of these quotes. Of all sins, original sin is the least, because it is the least voluntary. For it is voluntary not by the will of the person, but only by the will of the origin of our nature. The mildest punishment of all will be for those who are burdened with original sin only. There is no pleasure in original sin, as neither is there operation, for pleasure follows operation, as stated in Ethics, chapter 10. Therefore, punishment, by any sensible punishment, including fire, is not due to original sin. No further punishment is due to him besides the privation of that end to which the gift withdrawn destined him. Here we mean the beatific vision, which gift human nature is unable of itself to obtain. Now this is the divine vision, and consequently the loss of this vision is the proper and only punishment of original sin after death. If one is guided by reason, one does not grieve through being deprived of what is beyond one's power to obtain, but only through lack of that which, in some way, one is capable of obtaining. And here, that's basically the wise man will not necessarily despair over that which is out of his control, which may be somewhat of a consolation. I don't think that Virgil would necessarily describe this scenario as an ease, but it appears that Dante was on track with St. Thomas. In Canto 7 of the Purgatorio, Virgil converses with Sordello, sharing, I am Virgil, and for no other fault did I lose heaven than for not having faith. Not for doing, but for not doing did I lose the sight of the high sun, meaning God, that you desire and that I understood too late. Down there, meaning limbo, is a place not saddened with suffering, but only with shadows, where the laments sound not as shrieks, but as sighs. Here, we might reflect on how the great philosophers desired knowledge and now are excluded from the supreme opportunity for speculative activity, meaning the beatific vision. But while Dante seems to be in accord with the church teaching, there are several things to consider. There are some internal inconsistencies within the comedy. For example, Adam and Eve are harrowed away, and other pre-Abrahamic Shemites are harrowed away. This before Abraham and his justification by faith, and certainly, before Christ. There are redeemed pagans within the comedy, Trajan and Virtuous, for example. In Paradiso 20, Dante finds the Roman Emperor Trajan and the noble Trojan Virtuous. The legend is that through the prayers of Gregory I, Trajan was resurrected and then converted to Christ. Dante fabricated a story that Virtuous was granted a vision of Christ to come and was granted a ritual that affected baptism. We look at Statius, for example, and it's probable that he wasn't even Christian yet. Obviously, Dante considered him to be that, inserted him in the story, and he ascended up through purgatory after doing his time. And then we have, some ignored medieval contemporary strategies to release the virtuous pagans that Dante, for some reason or another, did not entertain. Perhaps if he did that, the story would not be as exciting or interesting. The idea of implicit or indistinct faith was raised by Hugh of St. Victor in the mid-12th century as he considered the salvation of Old Testament Jews. Peter the Lombard adopted similar notions. St. Thomas allowed for implicit faith. In De Veritate, he stated, the Gentiles were not placed as instructors of the divine faith, and so however wise they may have been in worldly wisdom, they should be counted among the minores. And so it was enough for them to have faith about the Redeemer implicitly, either in the faith of the prophets or in divine providence itself. And we have this notion of ancient theology. And what it relates to is that before the incarnation, Christian prophecies were known to people other than Jews. This was held by Abelard and Roger Bacon, and essentially is a way to argue that some of the virtuous pagans might not have really been pagans after all. And lastly, we have special inspiration, an idea that goes back to Abelard and appears in Aquinas that states that if a pagan were to follow the natural law, God would not let him die without the faith needed for salvation. Now, Dante has no magisterial authority, but that fact does not dismiss the problem of seemingly unjust justice. So as we consider this, and I would dare say that most everybody who reads the comedy would have, feelings of sadness for Virgil's predicament and that of other virtuous pagans. So how can we reconcile the notion of unredeemed virtuous pagans when we know that God, as reflected in 1 Timothy chapter 2, wills that everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth? Perhaps we can kind of go back to those strategies that Dante overlooked. The question here is, what does the 20th and 21st century church say? And I dare say they make use of some of those things that we have just talked about. Certainly, if we look at two poles, and before I get into it, let me explain the axes here. On the y-axis, we've got kind of the salvific inclusion. It goes from very restrictive to universalist, which means basically, hey, everybody's invited. And we have the mindset, and here you would think that it would be the soul that is up for the opportunity for salvation. You can go from despair, hey, I'm never going to get in, to a presumption of I'm in no matter what. So if we consider the lower left, that's kind of what's reflected in Mark 16, verse 16. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. Here there is the assumption that explicit Christian faith is absolutely necessary for salvation. And then in the upper right-hand corner, theologian Karl Rahner's radical and permissive notion of anonymous Christians, under which he holds the possibility that no one goes to hell. In other words, universal salvation. Rahner therefore believed that Jesus' discourses on the subject of hell were more admonitory than predictive. In other words, hey, I'm gonna talk about these things to scare you, to get you to do the right thing, rather than predicting that there actually will be souls that will end up in hell. All in all, perhaps Rahner is less radical than Jacques Maritain, who speculated that in the end, even Satan will be converted. As is true in many things, the answer might be more in the middle. There's hope in the middle. There's hope for Virgil in the middle. So the doctrine of salvation, still abiding within the balanced understanding that there is no salvation outside of the church, and that God established his church on earth, and through which his graces ordinarily flow, is not extremist. Surely God is divine mercy and divine justice, and he respects man's free will, which necessarily leaves the real conditional possibility of damnation. But there is a well-measured hope, as reflected in relatively recent church documents, such as Lumen Gentium and Dominus Iesus and Mystici Corporis, and other documents, that there has been recognition of two manners of belonging to the church. One, in actual fact, in re, and two, by desire, in voto. Consistent with that notion, the late Avery Cardinal Dulles states that we may conclude with certitude that God makes it possible for the unevangelized to attain a goal of their searching. Even atheists, he says, can be saved if they worship God under some other name and place their lives at the service of truth and justice. So in summary, what have we talked about? We've reviewed the predicament of the virtuous pagans from both a Dantean perspective and that of the church. There is much, but perhaps not perfect, alignment between Dante and the church. Certainly, he did not include some of those strategies for that would help from the perspective of salvation for the virtuous pagans. And some of that might be due to poetic license. Some of that might be as ideology as it relates to, secular government and the church, and so forth. Nevertheless, the Commedia is a didactic masterpiece. The church has not yielded in its dogma that there is no salvation outside of itself, but has acknowledged that salvation is not necessarily predicated only upon a soul's explicit Christian faith. And with that, we have reason to hope in the salvation of genuinely virtuous pagans. So there's still hope for Virgil. Thank you for your time.